going to focus a lot on CR uptake and the equity issues potentially around that. So as we know, around 1 in 3 Australian homes have rooftop solar and likely sell electricity to the grid. In some regions, it's probably closer to 1 in 2 homes. Based on a recent study we've looked into an Energex region, we estimate that around 1 in 4 households remarkably sell more electricity to the grid than they actually buy. I really echo Lewis's points before. That's actually a remarkable thing to think about. And recently accelerated by the federal government's battery program, we now see so many households installing batteries and then joining emerging products like VPPs and wholesale spot price pass-through products. We estimate that probably maybe around 1 in 19, 1 in 20 homes might have a battery now paired with their solar system. And I saw as of September last year, there were, remarkably to me, 50,000 homes were a customer of Amber Electric, so probably had a battery and are trading on the spot market maybe. So I think these examples reinforce this quite amazing transition that's happening before our very eyes, you know, the shift from the consumer to the prosumer, even if many of these people maybe don't see it that way. This transition then poses some interesting questions to me that I'm keen to explore. So for example, you know, what responsibilities, if any, should society place on someone that does export? You know, should someone with a battery be required to join into a VPP or participate in a market, even if they just installed a battery simply to lower their bills and actually reduce their reliance on the grid? What's the responsibility of retailers? You know, these VPP products maybe are more akin to financial products rather than essential services, so how do they manage risks on behalf of customers who maybe don't actually fully understand these risks and arguably probably never should? And then how should networks price customers who maybe increasingly resemble a generator rather than a customer when you look at their load profile? Or does this require rethinking network pricing altogether? Lastly, I think this transition forces us to ask also, and this has been hinted at a few times today, you know, what about everybody else? We estimate that maybe around 1 in 2 homes face a major barrier to solar and battery uptake. For example, they rent or they live in an apartment. So what's the solution? You know, do we try to give everyone solar for apartments, or do we just rethink what we are doing and encourage those who can participate to use their devices in ways that benefit everybody? We're going to tackle these questions with 4 experts now. I'm going to start with you, Lachlan. You're a leading researcher and expert in CR integration. In your view, is solar and batteries and CR more generally over-rewarded or under-rewarded? And what can we do to make the balance more appropriate?
Well, thanks very much. Lovely to be here and lovely to see everyone here. Lots of meaty questions, and we've got 31 minutes to answer them, so I'm not sure we'll get through all of them. But I think questions around balancing public and private good are really important, and if we get them right, then I think we get an energy transition that's underpinned by CER and DER. But if we get it wrong, I don't think we get that. And so some meaty topics to work through. When I think about public benefit, I tend to think about how consumer and distributed energy resources actually contribute to the NEO, which might sound like a technical sort of definition, but I think it's really important to actually be clear on what we mean by public benefit. So I'll sort of frame my remarks around that context. So I think there's 3 ways to answer the question. The first, I'd like to just sort of touch on where consumers can be rewarded, and maybe just to assess whether they are being rewarded fairly for participation in the system, for contributions to making the system operate more efficiently. The second part is just to look at the challenges and impediments, and we could do 4 or 5 hours on that, probably on its own. So I'm going to touch on a couple of things, but it's not going to be an exhaustive list. But what I'm going to get to is the third point, and that is whether customers actually want to contribute to the operation of the system. And that's the really interesting topic that I think we should be discussing here today, and I'm hoping to close out by being quite controversial. So in terms of where we are at the moment, I think there's probably 3 services, if you want to think about, that consumers can offer to the grid when they have distributed or consumer resources. The first is just simply as a form of generation and storage. And I think consumers, we have reached a compact with consumers where they see that's a really good deal. Consumers are buying heaps of solar, they're increasingly buying heaps of storage, they get benefits to their bill, and increasingly they get subsidies. as well. So if you look at, we go back, we had solar subsidies of various forms, and now we have storage subsidies of various forms. So I think this is a very successful compact that we've reached with consumers. And so that's kind of service number one. And we may not always think about that as a service, but actually as a form of generation and storage that actually delivers significant public benefit through increasing renewables, reducing carbon emissions, helping manage peak load in the grid. That is actually what we are rewarding them for when it comes to the subsidy. The second key services is really participation in AEMO markets. So you have to have a battery typically, you have to be in a VPP typically, but if you do, you tend to get rewarded, not tend to, you are rewarded on the same terms as every other asset in the market. So it's fair and equitable in terms of the reward you get, but you have to be in a VPP, and at the moment only 10 to 15% of battery holders are in a VPP, and I'm going to come back to this statistic time and time again because I think it actually is the crux of the discussion today. Third area, network services. Huge amounts of change in the distribution network. Consumer and distributed energy resources have a hugely important role to play in providing network services. I think anecdotally, less services delivered to the network than to AEMO markets, and there are challenges, genuine challenges, in how we increase that. So your typical VPP provider will more commonly participate in AEMO markets than they will in providing network services. So when it comes to some of the impediments, I think willingness to enrol in a VPP is actually a significant impediment at the moment, because if you don't want to be in a VPP, you actually can't offer services that are broadly useful to the energy system. And the fact that customers are not signing up to VPPs and they are actively choosing not to take subsidies that require them to sign up to VPPs is a pretty significant challenge for us. So we've got all these resources out there, but we actually can't leverage them because we can't get them into a VPP where we can then orchestrate them. So I think that is a very significant challenge. When it comes to network services, I'm not going to touch on this extensively, but I would just like to say delivering services to networks from distributed resources does not lend itself well to being delivered through a market because there is no fungibility in the services that are delivered. So your geographic location within the network dramatically changes how useful you are to the network. And that lack of fungibility means that a lot of economic constructs, particularly around market forming, are challenging to implement in that way. Maybe the broader philosophical point, I think, that does represent a significant impediment to us too is I'm actually not sure as a sector we've worked out whether we're integrating consumer energy resources or whether we're managing consumer energy resources. One is a very inclusive act where we think about how they can participate on par with other resources. The other is a very defensive act. And we've been having this discussion for probably 10 or 15 years, ever since we got the first DR in the system. If we actively would like more customer participation, we need to actually be clear that we're looking for integration. We're not trying to defend the system against DER. So this kind of brings me to my third point. I think it's really good to be controversial because otherwise you're sitting here all day, you'd like to hear some controversial points. So 15% of battery holders are currently participating in VPPs. And so my conjecture is that consumers have actually fundamentally rejected the value proposition of VPPs. And the fact that they are choosing not to enrol in VPPs when they are being offered subsidies directly to do so, and instead they're taking subsidies where they simply get to have the asset, to me means that the trade-off between public benefit and private good is simply not there. And the fact that they're turning down money to do it suggests to me that it's not just another economic incentive that we actually need. So my controversial provocation to you all is that I think the age of the VPP might be over. And if that's true, that has really significant consequences for how we might operate the system. And so I think through the course of the panel this afternoon and through the Q&A, I think that's the topic I'm really keen to explore, because it's not so much a question of whether these resources can contribute to the system. It's a question really of whether we'll be able to integrate them into the system to do so. Thanks very much.
Yeah, I'll go to John now. So you're obviously the CEO of a large distribution network in Australia. So you're seeing firsthand the rapid growth of solar, batteries and EVs. I'm interested to hear your perspective and how the network can unlock value for customers to potentially allow them to provide network services or lower network costs.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I'll just Lachlan's sought to be controversial, so I'll do the same in response and just say, in relation to the death of the VPP, maybe the VPP will be replaced by the VVPP, which is the virtual power plant, where a lot of these functions start happening in a far more amorphous manner because of the emergence of digital tools and Internet of Things and AI and everything that we're all currently grappling with. Let me make a comment at the outset, and that is that, and it really follows on from the comment I just made, that the future is very bright in terms of customer outcomes, given the ongoing emergence of digital systems, digital tools, and the ability to far more seamlessly manage energy flows within households and across networks. But that's a work in progress. It is to some extent currently and in the near to medium term offset by the inevitability of rising costs, particularly as we witness the build out of the transmission network and the development of renewable energy zones. And in the case of New South Wales, that translates into roadmap costs, which are a headache for distribution networks such as us, who need to pass those costs on, and inevitably that will give rise to further pressure. Probably worthwhile me just making a couple of comments on the essential energy network. On the essential energy network today, and we're a 900,000 connection, 2.5 or circa 2.5 gig peak load network. As we sit here today, we have in excess of 2.3 gigawatts of generating capacity in rooftop solar, and then there's a significant amount in excess of 1 gig of utility scale generation on the network as well. What that means a few things, but for the purposes of this discussion, most importantly, it means that we are reducing our consumption from the transmission network. So the consumption through bulk supply points into the essential energy network is declining, which means that as a network we're becoming more resilient, more self-reliant, more self-generating, if you like. It also, of course, means that we've got rising issues or challenges with voltage, reverse flows and such like, the physical challenges of managing that. In the essential energy case, we are very, very focused, as most networks are, on the proliferation of batteries and battery storage. Clearly, storage is the great white hope, if you like, in terms of ensuring that we can balance the system through the day and through longer periods of time. I don't know who in here knows exactly the amount of electrons curtailed, or the quantum of electrons or value of electrons curtailed from utility scale renewable generation on an annual basis. It's an enormous number, and the proliferation of batteries will go a long way to offsetting that and to better balancing the system. And Essential is playing a key role in ensuring that batteries can proliferate on our network, and we're doing that through trials and working through processes to lease available space adjacent to our zone substations to ensure that storage can proliferate on the network. The other two things we're working on very hard to ensure that this works well is the development, and this is now the long-term development of a digital twin, which has allowed us to much more accurately model the capacity of our network, and that has clearly shown that there is very significant capacity across the bulk of the network the vast majority of the time, which has allowed us to give active consideration to dynamic export limits or increased export limits, and then the emergence of dynamic operating envelopes, which allows the network to operate on a far more dynamic basis and create much better outcomes for customers. A couple of comments before I hand back. Two sort of key areas of focus. The first is in relation to tariff structures, and I'll just say here sort of unequivocally, the current system by which networks generate tariffs pass those tariffs on to retailers. Retailers then bundle them or not bundle them into offerings to customers is highly inefficient. It needs to be substantively reformed to ensure that we are getting the best possible outcomes for customers, and the offerings, the retail offerings or the service offerings in the market, which network services are an integral part of for customers, actually reflect what's available and what's possible in this far different environment we now operate in. And so clearly there is a need for significant reform of the development of tariffs, the nature of tariffs and the way tariffs are implemented, and it's great to see the work the Australian Energy Market Commission has recently done on that. The other comment is just in relation, and this goes back to, once again, the Energy Market Commission's reference to fixed charges, and I won't say anything on the whole question of fixed charges, given the discussion that was had very openly on the previous panel. What I would say, though, is that when we're thinking about fixed charges, and I appreciate there are a wide range of strongly held views on the notion of networks increasing fixed charges, and I completely agree with the comment that Claire Savage made, that just a simple or a simplistic increase in fixed charges is not going to solve the problem. The thing I think we should all have firmly in mind is the extent to which government subsidies and incentives for both rooftop solar and now batteries to an extent have seen lower income households effectively subsidise higher income households who have been able to afford panels and batteries, simply because so much of network revenue and system revenue is captured on a volumetric basis, and as higher income households consume less, they're effectively contributing less to the system. And something has to be done to actually address that challenge and ensure that the system doesn't continue to be regressive and have an adverse impact on lower income households or renters, or as the case may be, who are unable to avail themselves of panels and batteries. And the final comment I'd make, just in the interest of my own business and the system more generally, there's been a few comments made today around installation and the servicing of solar panels and batteries and the system more generally, and I'll just note the recent commitment Essential Energy's made to developing a industry training academy, which will be headquartered in Tamworth in regional New South Wales. And that's a significant investment on the part of the organisation I have the pleasure of leading, to ensure that there are ample training facilities in regional New South Wales to ensure a steady supply of suitably qualified technicians who can actually service this industry and make things better as we go forward. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I might put you on the spot later with fixed network tariffs if we have time. Leah, we hear often this CER have and have nots discussion, and I feel small businesses are often excluded from that, and they seem to fit in that have not bucket. What would you like to see happen to help small businesses move potentially into that have bucket?
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to be here. So I guess first I'd like to start with saying that everyone knows that, and I want to say small and medium-sized businesses, I feel at the moment medium-sized businesses are my new missing middle, because, the current economic climate, small, medium business is now struggling just like a small business. So first of all, in saying that, I'd like to say that we all know that their resources and finances are a huge barrier to, putting on solar and investing in a battery. At Business New South Wales, we represent about 50,000 business members across the entire state. We do a business conditions survey quarterly, and since mostly 2022, but even before that, energy costs is in the top 3 concerns every quarter. In saying that, when it comes to investing in sort of solar and battery for businesses to help them, recently, I think it was in November, I put in 4 questions on their barriers to electrification. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because the top barrier was that capital upfront investment. at the moment with the rates, taxes, insurance has gone through the roof, for those who aren't aware. It's just really hard to then go buy batteries and solar. Also, in saying that, there's a lot of businesses are very complex. I'd just like to put that out there. Small and medium-sized businesses are very complex. It's not like looking at energy to residential customers. And you've also got those businesses which is sort of, I'd say, hard to electrify. You've got gas-reliant businesses who can't simply just buy rooftop solar and put in a battery because of technology or it's too expensive. And when I say technology, there's a lot of businesses who use gas, for example, as a feedstock, so it's not that easily replaceable. In terms of going to your question of what I'd like to see, I guess more, number one, helping small businesses with the capital upfront cost, and that in terms of, whatever it is, grants or subsidies, the federal battery subsidies has just been so successful. You can see that when you help someone, they're going to take it up, and I don't think business is any different. In terms of tax, I think there could be tax incentives to help business in this. This is an area I'm not an expert in, but I know Business New South Wales is pushing quite hard this year on tax reforms. Secondly, I'd like to see businesses rewarded for doing it. So market frameworks don't really reflect that for business. I know they're trying, but in terms of recognizing businesses, shifting their load or decreasing their peak demand, it's not that simple for some businesses. So currently the recognition and reward system is not quite getting back to business, and therefore they're not really investing in that rooftop solar if they can. I think one thing I'd also really like to mention, and that at Business New South Wales we've been plugging for quite a few years, is that there is nowhere for businesses to go for advice on energy. Energy Made Easy does not help a complex business who manufacture or do food processing. And we've been pushing actually this year that for those from New South Wales, that the New South Wales government used to have Business Connect. They're bringing Business Connect back due to its success. And we think there should be a sort of Business Connect for energy, because we get a lot of members that they don't even know what the transition is, like that far. So you're asking about, CER, and I'm telling you they're just like, what? Transition what? And it has got to that. So we really think that there needs to be an independent body, because they only talk to their retailers or they talk to their rooftop and solar, installer, and that's the consumer face, that there needs to be an independent body. They can go ask for advice. They can ask for knowledge. Where do they fit in the transition? When or where should they, install rooftop solar? Will it benefit them? And then I guess lastly, I would just say that, and I always want to comment on this at these forums, is that you can't forget those businesses who it is hard to electrify. At Business New South Wales, we do we work with ACCI a lot federally, and we agree that we need a sort of fuel neutral approach into decarbonisation. So it's not just CER you'd be looking at, but you need to give businesses an option. Subsidies and grants don't always help if the businesses just rooftop and solar don't fit the complexity of the way they produce energy, either high heat or they use, let's say, as I said earlier, like gas as a feedstock as an example. That may not always be the simple solution.
Thank you. I think your comments at the end about navigating complexity really tie into my next question to Chris. So these new VPP or wholesale spot pass-through battery projects can be quite complex and pose risks to people. How do you at the SEC help try to simplify engagement and participation in some of these new emerging services?
Thanks very much, Ashley, and it's great to be with you all today. I'll certainly get to that question and share some insights that we've gleaned from the work we've done in terms of the barriers that consumers face in engaging with the market generally. But I just want to say it's terrific to be part of a panel where people are bringing provocations. So, Lachlan, thanks for bringing it. That's meant that I'm not going to go where I expected to go. I do want to comment on the VPP and the kind of death or future of VPPs. I probably wouldn't go quite so far as to say the VPP's dead, but I think what you've said is essentially laying down the gauntlet to the market, in particular retail and service providers, to completely reconfigure the way that they explain and offer value to consumers. particularly consumers that are looking to, or have the capacity to, take up these sort of technologies. And I think as an industry, we've probably skipped a couple of steps. There's been a lot of talk today about trust, and there is still a trust deficit in the sector. Unless that deficit is bridged and managed, you can't have that conversation with a consumer. The other important element of this is the technology. And there's a real job for the industry to do in ensuring that there is high uptake of the technology, even if it's not fully activated at this point in time, if all of that, the potential is not unlocked. I should just explain briefly what the SEC is and what we're doing. So we are a Victorian government-owned state company, and we have a role in accelerating the transition to renewables in Victoria and critically ensuring that the benefits of the transition flow directly to the communities that are hosting assets, but in particular to the consumers that are ultimately the beneficiaries and the reason we do all of this. We operate right across the value chain. We're investing in large-scale generation and storage, and our mandate is essentially to accelerate and ensure investment where the private sector isn't necessarily investing at the scale or at the speed that's required. So we take a very strong additionality lens to our large-scale work. We are retailing. We're a reasonably significant retailer. We retail to government and non-government customers, and we're offering 100% renewable solutions and helping those customers decarbonise. And then thirdly, and most relevantly, we are working directly with households to help households switch from gas to electricity. And there's a particular Victorian context to all of this, which is that in Victoria, we have a very high dependence on gas at the household level. Nearly 80% of households are dual fuel, use both gas and electricity. And we're at a point now where there is so much opportunity to be realised for households, especially in switching from gas to electric, significant savings for a typical home, somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000 per annum if you switch from gas to electricity. Those savings are higher if you've got solar on your roof. And right now, if you switch in Victoria from dual fuel to electricity, you're actually significantly reducing your emissions intensity, even with the mix at the moment. So what, about 40% renewables in the Victorian electricity supply system. Strong legislated targets in Victoria, 95% renewable by 2035. So what we're essentially trying to do is renewify the grid, renewify supply, and connect demand with that renewable supply by electrifying homes in particular. We've been busy over the last couple of years doing research and conducting pilots in market to understand what these barriers for households are. And I'll just share with this audience the key themes that are coming up in that research and those pilots are there is still low awareness of this electrification thing and why it might be cheaper, what the appliances do and whether they are effective at doing what we know they can do. There is a trust deficit. We've talked a lot about that. There is high complexity and high touch for consumers that are looking to make those changes. Affordability comes up as a constant theme. And then finally, consumers struggle to access trusted installers that then can execute electrification plans. So all of that for us has informed the design of a new electrification platform. We're calling it a one-stop shop, but it is essentially a platform that is intended to motivate households to act and electrify by providing independent, impartial information about the benefits and the paybacks, and then assists households to then take the action by making a plan, working out which appliances to replace, which ones to do first, and then connecting those households with installers. By the time of launch, we're aiming to launch this financial year, we will have the entire state covered. So wherever you are in Victoria, you'll have access to this platform and you'll have access to an installer that can come out and help you execute that plan. I know we're short on time, but there's a sequencing point to all of this that I think is really important. We're very conscious of all of the opportunities presented by high uptake of heat pumps and batteries and solar and so forth, but we want to increase the uptake first and ensure that's done in a way with our consumers that generates trust. will then come to the question of how we can coordinate and unlock that value that's very real, particularly at the local level, to increase utilisation of network by essentially using household appliances to better optimise between supply and demand at that localised level.
Thank you. A question for the panel. So we saw the solar sharer offer was introduced partly so we could share to the wider public the benefits of abundant rooftop solar. I'd like to hear your views on how successful you predict the scheme to be to achieve that goal, and ask if you have any thoughts on what guardrails may be needed to ensure that maybe someone's individual actions doesn't lead to some unintended consequences or costs for others. Who wants to go first? You want to go?
Yeah, I'm happy to have a stab at this one. So firstly, I think the premise or the policy intent behind the scheme is understandable. There is a whole lot of debate about tariffs that are imposed by regulation as opposed to evolved by the market. I'd probably have a preference for the latter. But I think there's an underlying issue here that might affect the success or otherwise of this scheme, however it's originated. And that is, in order for it to deliver value for consumers, there needs to be significant behaviour change and an understanding of why time of day matters. Time of use tariffs are great, I think, but they're only great if consumers understand why they matter and engage with them. And to date, I don't think the industry's done a great job of explaining why time of use is important or providing the transparency to consumers on those tariffs. And if I just go to one very brief example, if you think about the blowback right across Australia from the reduction or abolition of solar feed-in tariffs, people are responding to 10, 15 years of messaging explaining why feed-in tariffs are a really good thing and why solar is a really good thing. The blowback's completely understandable. Now to turn around and say to consumers, oh, by the way, you've got to charge your appliances and use your appliances during the middle of the day, is one thing, but it needs to be accompanied by some concerted messaging, some simple, trusted messaging to consumers on behalf of those that are providing the services as to why this matters.
John?
I very much agree with the comments that have been just been made. I think, and once again, I'll reference Claire Savage. She just talked about not expecting huge take-up under that scheme. And I agree with that, but I primarily agree with it because I think inevitably the market will actually provide services or products that ensure that energy is consumed in the middle of the day when it's plentiful. And that will become even more probable and capable or possible with the emergence of additional storage on the network, additional storage in the system, and also, of course, the ongoing or further proliferation of electric vehicles, and particularly bi-directional electric vehicles, which will allow for that greater opportunity for time shifting of electrons between the plentiful middle of the day and the not so plentiful evening. And yes, there just needs to be further evolution in the market there to ensure that is actually what's achieved. And that probably, to the point on feed-in tariffs, it really, in some ways, it counters the anomaly where consumers are still getting a price signal that exporting electrons in the middle of the day is a valuable thing to do, and that's clearly an economically inefficient signal.
So I agree in the policy intent. I think it's right. It's right to send a signal. I think what we're seeing very broadly, though, and this is true of solar sharer, it's true of network tariff changes that are being proposed, is that we're looking for lots of single solutions and saying, we'd like a single solution and it will fix the problem. But it's going to be a bit like playing whack-a-mole. You find a solution to one problem, so you say, we fix this now, and something else pops up elsewhere. And you can't do an energy transition through dozens of individual solutions. And so what I would really like to see is that instead of this kind of random collection of individual solutions, we actually have a collection of things that work well together. So how does solar sharer work with network tariff reform? Are they actually consistent? Will you get the right things that come out of it? And that's just two solutions that we're working on. And so I think, unfortunately, this is a complex world that we're operating in, and we're actually probably going to need some more complicated solutions rather than just a collection of really simple ones.
I know we're out of time, but I want to ask this question to Leah. So you've seen a lot of pricing reform aimed just at households. Do you want to see any reforms for business tariffs?
Oh, absolutely. As John said, I also agree with John in that I think the whole system needs reform. And I think that businesses are often overlooked, small businesses in particular. Although some small businesses you can fit into sort of a household model. I would say those medium-sized businesses you definitely need to look at specialized tariff offerings, and again having that place to go for businesses to have time to even ask about it would be great. Just I want to say one thing about the solar share thing though, if I could, because I can see the minus here, so I'm getting stressed. But the policy intent, it's great. It's just that from a complete business perspective, if you're a cafe, you can't shift your use. If you're a manufacturer, maybe some can, but some can't. But businesses, you operate when you operate, and shifting that is very challenging. So that's all I want to say for that.
Can I just make a very quick comment? I'm just going to add to what Leah said, because there's been commentary today that there is very significant latent capacity or available capacity in distribution networks. That's generally the case. And then on the question of tariffs and incentives for commercial and industrial customers, I'll just make a quick comment, and that is that work we've done within Essential indicates there's somewhere between 3 and 4 gigawatts of electrifiable load on our network, so in regional New South Wales, that's currently serviced by non-electrical fuels, so gas, coal, diesel, as the case may be, within the commercial and industrial sector. And what we consistently come up against is that those businesses, whilst there would be a long-term economic benefit in electrifying, they can't fund the upfront transition, and the upfront transition normally happens within a time, or the upfront investment normally happens within a time frame that doesn't allow for electrification, i.e. the boiler blows up and the only option is to buy a new boiler rather than electrifying, because that's a much longer process. And I think there is an opportunity for government to seriously consider some strong incentives for industry to actually electrify where there is the opportunity to do so, and that will be particularly valuable in a period where there are charges that are ultimately controlled by government, i.e. roadmap costs in New South Wales, which are increasing costs. So if there's more consumption of electrons across the system, that will actually help mitigate that impact.
Please thank our panel.